2024. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Boynton?
Here.
Mrs. Macklin?
Here.
Mr. Akins?
Here.
Mrs. Turner Birch? Mrs. Carter?
Here. Thank you. Would you please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item number 2.01 is our acknowledgement of our goals. Please read them at your leisure. Item number 3.01 is our consent agenda. Could I have a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented?
Motion to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
It's been moved by by Mr. Akins and second by Mrs. Carter. Do we have any questions or discussion about the agenda? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Akins?
Yes.
Mrs. Carter?
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton?
Yes.
Mrs. Macklin?
Yes. Motion passes 4-0. Thank you, Board. Item number 4 is our superintendent's report, 4.01. Dr. Johnson, do you want to speak on this before?
Good evening, Board President, Vice President, and Board members. I ask for your approval of the following agenda item. This is just an amendment. All classified administrators' contracts in June 30th and not July 31st. So that's why we needed to amend this one for Mr. Westbrook.
Motion to approve recommendation for administrative personnel as presented.
Second. It's been moved by Mrs. Carter and second by Mrs. Macklin. Questions, Board? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Mrs. Carter?
Yes.
Mrs. Macklin?
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton?
Yes.
Mr. Akins?
Yes.
Motion passes 4-0. Thank you, Board. Item number 5 is our treasury report. Mrs. Armstrong.
Good morning, Board President, Vice President, and Board members. I have 4 items on the agenda today, 5 items actually. So the first item is the advance to the general fund to grants. And the second item is fund-to-fund transfers. The third item is the approval of transferring stale checks to the unclaimed funds. The fourth item is the approval of the final appropriations for fiscal year '24. And then the fifth item is the temporary appropriations for fiscal year '25. Did you want me to briefly talk about those, or you kind of remember these from last year?
I do, but Board, would you like to hear more?
I would like to hear more about them. Yeah, please, okay. So for the advance of the general funds, so an advance is a loan to grants. So these are any grants that we can't do a final drawdown and have the cash by today. So that's a loan to the general fund, so we don't have a negative cash balances required by the state. The fund-to-fund transfers are actually transferring out of general fund or out of a grant to general fund. In the case of the transfers to the general fund from grants, I put in your notes, there were some meetings from June of '22 and July of '22 that we transferred funds into these grants, and it didn't need to be there, so I'm just returning the money back to the general fund to close out these accounts. The ones going out are for grants typically from last year that we didn't get reimbursement for multiple reasons. It could be it wasn't properly coded, so it was items that we couldn't get refunds or reimbursements for. Also, for instance, the closing the achievement gap, we know that we don't completely cover the benefits for that person, so we always have to pick up the difference. So that's what those transfers into other funds are. As far as the transfer to unclaimed funds, according to Ohio Revised Code, and also as a part of our audit, it was one of the items identified that we were keeping stale checks on our books. So we transfer it to our unclaimed funds. It sits there for 5 years. we have to put it there with detailed information for the name of the person or the company, so that they can always come back and claim the funds. After it sits in the unclaimed for 5 years, then I will come back to the board and do a request to transfer it to general fund then. So this is just the motion to move it into that holding account, and then after 5 years, we move it back to our general fund. The final appropriations for fiscal year '24, again, is required by the county and Ohio Revised Code. We have to submit what we believe our final numbers will be for this fiscal year, and what our final appropriations will be, and our final certificate of estimated resources. And then the temporary is so that we can open up the books on Monday and begin to issue our 7/1 purchase orders. So we have to have a temporary budget submitted to the county. So both of these will go to the county today, so that we can start operating on 7/1.
And then with these stale checks, like they can come back at any time and say, hey, write me another check because I want my funds.
Say that again, for the unclaimed funds?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the other option that we have is you can actually send it to the state's Ohio claim funds, where they,
Right.
go on there, that's the other option, but for schools, it's a revised code that we're allowed to handle it this way.
And then it comes back into our.
It comes back into our account, but someone can come at any time and request that amount, so we have to keep a record of it.
For only 5 years.
No, 5 years, we have to let it sit in unclaimed.
okay,
We can't move it to our general fund
Okay.
balance. After
Right.
that, we can move it there.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. And those were, do you have any other questions on that?
Nope.
Okay.
Okay, can I have a motion then for 5.01? Motion to approve, wait, 501. Motion to approve, advance of general funds.
Second.
It's been moved by Mrs. Carter and second by Mrs. Macklin. Discussion? Or we just have one? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Carter,
Yes.
Mrs. Macklin,
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton,
Yes.
Mr. Akins,
Yes.
Mrs. Turner Birch.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Board. Could I have a motion to approve 5.02, please? Motion to approve. Motion to approve. Second. It's been moved by Mrs. Macklin, second by Mrs. Carter. Any questions? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Macklin,
Yes.
Mrs. Carter,
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton,
Yes.
Mr. Akins,
Yes.
Mrs. Turner Birch.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Board. Item number 5.03. Could I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve transfer of unclaimed funds.
Second. Moved by Mr. Akins, second by Mrs. Carter. Any questions or discussion? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Akins,
Yes.
Mrs. Carter,
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton,
Yes.
Mrs. Macklin,
Yes.
Mrs. Turner Birch.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Board. 5.04, could I have a motion, please, to approve?
Motion to approve final appropriation and certification of estimate resources fiscal year '24.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Carter, second by Mr. Akins. Questions? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Carter,
Yes.
Mr. Akins,
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton,
Yes.
Mrs. Macklin,
Yes.
Mrs. Turner Birch.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Board. And finally, 5.05. Could I have a motion to approve, please?
Motion to approve.
Second.
It's been moved by Mrs. Macklin and second by Mrs. Carter. Questions? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Mrs. Macklin,
Yes.
Mrs. Carter,
Yes.
Mrs. Boynton,
Yes.
Mr. Akins,
Yes.
Mrs. Turner Birch.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Board. Item number 6.01 is our motion, I need a motion to approve the CRA agreement with the Village of Long Hills. I do want to say before we even get into this, I don't know if everyone has had a chance to read the final copy. We did receive it within the hour. It has been submitted by, we've the attorney did, look it over, talk about it, which one to say something about it,
yeah, so
I'm
he
sure, but we
did.
just got it.
So he did review it, and there were some changes that he submitted to the, village to make changes for, and he got those back this morning. He did say he's available by phone if anyone has any questions, that they want answered. But he said this morning that they made all of the changes that he requested.
And I just want everyone to know that at the 10:30 last night, nothing had happened, so I didn't get a chance to even send it out to really fully read it, and so.
Yeah, I would like to see the copy with the changes.
The
This
version on
is,
here
it
is
is,
that.
this
I
is
just
the
wrote it.
final
you just
copy
did it?
now. She
Okay.
uploaded
Okay.
it before we
Wanted to
came
make
in,
sure.
actually before I sent you guys
Gotcha.
the message, because I had not seen it.
Did
But
they
if
state
it was
the changes
only
were?
updated within an hour and we haven't had an opportunity to review those updates.
So it was, what I forwarded to you, and it had I included all time suggestions.
Right.
Tom is basically saying they did what he
They
asked.
did, yes. So there were
it's
three
updated
things
to
on there.
reflect
Right.
Those
Those
changes.
All
changes
those comments
that,
that he
he
had
has
in
stated.
there.
Yes.
He said they did everything he asked.
And I'm gonna say this, and again, I know we're trying to build these relationships, we're trying to build communication and honesty. They knew we were having our meeting today, I would prefer to, again, that's why we asked for 2 days ago, so we can read and appropriately make sure that everything in here is what we've asked for. Because they came to us and asked us for our counter and wanted it right away. We should be able to get what we asked for when we ask for it. And that's not fair. I wanna be able to read through this and make sure, which is why we asked for the today's the 29th, we asked for the 26th, 25th. That was 3 days ago, and we're getting it at 8 o'clock this morning, that's not fair.
Was that at 8 or 9:30?
Either way it goes, we didn't get it until this morning, and we asked for it 3 days ago.
I would just like to remind the board, I do agree with everything you're saying. I did look at the one page, one of the changes was change city to village. I did look at that was changed. I guess we could look it over, we can take a break and look at it,
I would
just
prefer- I
review
I was gonna ask for
everything.
recess.
And so, do I have to have a motion for that?
Yes.
Could I have a motion to enter into,
Motion to enter into recess to review Exhibit A.
that's
Some further detail. Second.
It's been moved by Mrs. Carter and second by Mrs. Birch. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Carter,
Yes.
Mrs. Birch,
Yes.
Mrs. Blanton,
Yes.
Mrs. Macklin,
Yes.
Mr. Akins.
Yes.
We will enter into recess at this time.